The most dangerous stage of wealth is not poverty. It is early success. Poverty is obvious. You can feel it pressing on your throat. The bills arrive on time, the account balance does not, and every mistake introduces itself loudly. But as your net worth starts to rise, the danger becomes quieter. The risks stop looking like emergencies and start looking like privileges. A little concentration feels like conviction. A little lifestyle inflation feels like reward. A little tax sloppiness feels harmless. A little illiquidity feels sophisticated. A little overconfidence feels earned. That is how a fortune begins to leak. Most people think wealth is a mountain. I do not. I think it is a fortress. And a fortress rarely falls because one barbarian smashed through the front gate in broad daylight. It falls because 10 small weaknesses were left unattended. One wall was too thin. One gate was never reinforced. One officer got arrogant. One supply line was ignored. One fire was treated as smoke. One map went out of date. One exit route was blocked. One repair was postponed because the weather was good and the owner felt safe. That is how your net worth gets destroyed. Not in one glorious collapse, in a series of tolerated cracks. The source document is really about those cracks. It begins with overconcentration, moves through lifestyle inflation, tax inefficiency, refinancing laziness, overworking, blind confidence, complexity, illiquidity, retirement delay, and insufficient insurance. Underneath those examples sits one deeper truth. As net worth grows, your financial enemies become more subtle, more respectable, and more expensive. Fay file a site fay turn 80 file 0 fay. That is the truth I want to drill into you. The bigger your fortress gets, the more disciplined you must become about invisible weaknesses. When people are broke, they know they are vulnerable. When people begin to accumulate wealth, they often become psychologically weaker at exactly the moment their decisions become more important. That is because small success creates a false sense of immunity. You start thinking the fortress can take the hit. You start trusting your instincts more than the structure. You start believing that because you survived a few storms, the walls must be strong. They are not always strong. Sometimes they are just untested. The first crack most people build into their fortress is overconcentration. It begins innocently. One stock does well. One investment becomes the hero of your portfolio. You tell yourself that trimming it would be stupid because it is the reason you got ahead. Soon the position is no longer just an investment. It is your pride, your identity, your proof that you were right. That is when concentration stops being a portfolio decision and becomes a psychological addiction. The source uses a blunt example. If you have a $100,000 portfolio and $50,000 of it sits in one stock, then your future depends far too much on a single outcome. It points to Intel as a warning. At the peak of the dot-com era, Intel traded around $65, and even after the AI boom, it still had not fully reclaimed that old high, while the broad market multiplied many times over. Fay file site, fay turn 80 file 0 fay. That is not a trivia fact. That is a graveyard marker. People love the fantasy of concentration when the bet is working. It makes them feel like generals. But what concentration really does is turn one story into your oxygen supply. The minute you do that, your objectivity dies. I call this the hero stock trap. The hero stock trap makes you emotionally dependent on one position. You stop asking whether the asset still deserves its weight and start asking what kind of person would betray a winner. That is how rational people become evangelists. They stop owning the asset. The asset owns them. The fortress version of this is obvious. You have put too much of your army at one gate. If the gate holds, you look brilliant. If it breaks, you are finished faster than you believe possible. I do not build fortresses that way. No single tower should decide the survival of the whole structure. That is why wise portfolio builders usually want no single stock to dominate the castle. You want stable long-term compounding, not theatrical dependence. The public finds it boring because the public is addicted to stories. Wealth is usually protected by structures, not stories. The second crack arrives in nicer clothes, lifestyle inflation. This is one of the most elegant ways people destroy a rising net worth because it never feels destructive while it is happening. It feels like fairness. You worked harder, your income rose, your title improved, your house can be slightly better. The car can be a little newer, the vacations can get softer around the edges, the restaurants can become more frequent, the furniture can become more adult, the neighborhood can become more impressive, the standard becomes your new normal so fast that gratitude dies and fixed cost takes its place. The source gives a stat that should humiliate anyone who still thinks high income automatically means control. It points to a Goldman Sachs chart showing that even among people earning above $300,000 a year, a shocking share still say they live paycheck to paycheck. Even some above $500,000 say the same. Felicite Fayturn 80 file 0 Fay read that again. $500,000 can still produce a prisoner. That tells you the problem is not only arithmetic, it is appetite. Lifestyle inflation is not just spending more, it is hardening your cost structure until your income has to keep winning every single month, just to hold the illusion together. I call this velvet concrete. It feels soft on the way in. It hardens around your feet before you notice you cannot move. The source references the millionaire next door and makes the right point. Many of the truly wealthy maintain simple habits, even as income climbs. Felicite Fayturn 80 file 0 Fay. That is not because they hate pleasure. It is because they understand the difference between a richer life and a more expensive cage. Meaningful experiences are fine. Better standards can be fine. I am not asking you to become a monk with brokerage access. I am asking you to notice when a reward becomes a recurring liability. The fortress falls the moment you start paying tribute to appearances. Do not play that game of comparison. Comparison is a tax on net worth that never stops billing. The third crack looks technical, which is why otherwise intelligent people postpone it until it quietly strips them for years. Tax inefficiency. The source says taxes will likely be one of your largest expenses, often bigger than your rent, your car, or anything else you buy. It calls out 3 common mistakes: ignoring tax loss harvesting, placing investments in the wrong accounts, and underestimating capital gains taxes when selling appreciated positions. It even gives a practical example of putting high dividend stocks in taxable brokerage accounts instead of sheltered accounts like IRAs, causing needless annual tax drag. Felicite Fayturn 80 file 0 Fay. This is one of the deepest differences between people who merely earn money and people who protect it. The amateur celebrates gross returns. The adult studies what survives after the tax system finishes eating. I call this the hidden drain pipe. A fortress can look magnificent from the road while water is quietly being siphoned out underneath the walls. That is what tax inefficiency does. The structure looks intact, the portfolio looks fine, the income looks healthy, and yet year after year unnecessary leakage turns ambition into mediocrity. Taxes are not optional, sloppiness is. You cannot stop the authorities from taking a cut, but you can refuse to leave extra meat on the table because the paperwork felt boring. Fill the tax-advantaged accounts. Understand long-term capital gains treatment. Know what belongs in sheltered accounts and what belongs in taxable ones. Use losses strategically instead of emotionally. If you refuse to learn this, then part of your fortress is essentially open to thieves who send receipts. And then there is the fourth crack, which most people will disguise as laziness, timing, inconvenience, or we'll look at it later. Refinancing opportunities ignored. The source does the math clearly. On a $400,000 mortgage, dropping the rate from 7 to 6% can save roughly $263. Per month, refinancing costs might run around $10,000, which means you need around 38 months to break even. So the move depends on how long you plan to stay. Felicite Fayturn 80 file 0 Fay. That is the sort of arithmetic adults should be able to do in their sleep. But many do not. Why? Because refinancing is not exciting. It does not feel like progress. It feels like paperwork, calls, signatures, comparison tables, mild annoyance, and a task nobody will praise you for completing. Yet that boring work can alter decades of cash flow. I call this gate friction gate. Friction is what happens when a perfectly rational improvement is left undone, because the gate to execute it is tedious. Wealth is often protected not by genius, but by willingness to walk through boring gates before most people do. This applies far beyond mortgages. Any high-interest debt deserves scrutiny. If rates fall, if your credit improves, if the terms can be cleaned up, if the monthly drag can be reduced on a horizon that still makes economic sense, then you need to run the numbers. Not emotionally cleanly. A fortress owner who refuses to oil the gates because the hinges are annoying should not be shocked when movement becomes expensive. The fifth crack is more seductive because society often rewards it with applause. Overworking. The source says this trap is not about money directly, but about time, and it gives a strong example. If you have $5 million invested and earn a conservative 5% annual return, That capital generates about $250,000 a year, or roughly $684 a day. At that point, you must ask when the return from another hour of labor begins to matter less than what the capital is already doing. Fei-Felicite Fei-Turn 80 File 0 Fei. This is a hard truth for high achievers because work can become identity, anesthesia, and moral proof all at once. At first, overworking helps you build the fortress later. If you do not evolve, it keeps you chained to the same wall after the fortress no longer needs your blood at the old rate. I call this the labor loyalty trap. It is the habit of continuing to live as though your hands are still the highest return asset in the system, long after capital has started compounding on your behalf. Work matters, purpose matters, building matters. I am not preaching retirement as a religion. I am telling you that as net worth grows, the value of your attention changes. If you do not update that equation, you risk sacrificing the very life the fortress was supposed to protect. Most people die regretting they worked too much and lived too little. That line appears in different forms everywhere because it is true often enough to become a cliché. The cliché survives because people keep ignoring it. Do not wait until you are gray and solvent to realize your time had a higher return than the extra meeting. The sixth crack is arrogance. This one is especially lethal because it usually arrives dressed as confidence, and confidence gets rewarded long before reality collects. The source tells a story of a friend who held just 10 stocks. Then, after strong results in 2023 and 2024, became arrogant, shrank the portfolio further to 5 names, used call options around earnings, and even used margin. Later, the portfolio was down more than 30%, while the S&P 500 was down only a little. The document's verdict is simple and correct. A few good years do not make you a genius. It also quotes the broader reality that the large majority of day traders lose money. Fei-Felicite Fei-Turn 80 File 0 Fei. I call this the bull market hallucination. A rising tide is the easiest liar in finance. In a strong environment, almost any reckless strategy can masquerade as insight for a while. Concentration looks visionary. Options look brilliant. Margin looks efficient. Risk looks sophisticated. The problem is not that those tools exist. The problem is that early wins convince fools they have discovered a permanent edge, when what they really discovered was favorable weather. The fortress version is obvious. You mistake a calm season for proof that the walls cannot fail. So you thin the guards, stack the treasury near one tower, and congratulate yourself for being bolder than other men. Then the siege begins. Real confidence gets more humble as stakes rise. False confidence gets louder. If you are becoming wealthier, you must become more suspicious of your own intoxication after success. The market does not care how proud you were last year. The seventh crack is complexity. The source warns about over-complex financial management as wealth grows. Multiple brokerage accounts, multiple bank accounts, angel investments, private deals, real estate partnerships, scattered assets, hidden fees, and misunderstood risks all begin to accumulate. It notes that many high-income people pretend to understand major investments better than they actually do. Fei-Felicite Fei-Turn 80 File 0 Fei. This is one of the most dangerous vanity traps in all of personal finance. Complexity can make you feel important. That does not mean it makes you rich. I call this the maze trap. The maze trap happens when your financial life becomes so scattered that no single mind is actually governing it. You have positions here, accounts there, paperwork elsewhere, exposure to one project you barely remember, one friend's deal you liked, one private investment you never fully understood, 3 different logins, 6 different fee structures, and one comforting story that says because it is diversified across many things, it must be smart. Number, if you cannot see the whole fortress from above, you do not know where the weak walls are. Complexity creates blind spots, and blind spots are where expensive surprises breed. Fees hide there, correlations hide there, liquidity mismatches hide there, tax accidents hide there. So do delusions. If your assets and income have reached the point where you are pretending to understand the structure instead of actually understanding it, then you need simplicity, consolidation, or professional help. Pretending is not a strategy. The 8th crack is illiquidity. This one is deadly because it fools people with paper wealth. The source says many households between $1 million and $2 million still lack real liquidity because a large portion of their wealth is trapped in housing and retirement accounts. It emphasizes the danger of being wealthy on paper but cash poor when an opportunity or emergency appears. Feifilicite Fei turn 80 file 0 Fei that should terrify you if you care about freedom. I call this the marble prison. Marble prison means the fortress looks magnificent from the outside. But when a fire breaks out, you cannot get water where it needs to go. The walls are expensive, the floors are polished, the value is there on paper. But try to raise meaningful cash in 7 days, and suddenly your net worth starts behaving like museum stone. Liquidity is not glamorous. That is why people underweight it until reality humiliates them. You do not need all your wealth in cash. That would be a different kind of stupidity. But if too much of your life is trapped in things that cannot move when you need them to move, then your fortress has no internal supply lines. It can survive peace and fail under pressure. The source mentions the basic rule of keeping at least 3 to 6 months of expenses liquid, and argues that for high-income, low-expense people with growing net worth, more liquid assets can be a real advantage, because opportunities can appear suddenly. Feifilicite Fei turn 80 file 0 Fei. Exactly. Cash is not only protection, it is optionality, and optionality is one of the purest forms of wealth. The ninth crack is one of the oldest and still one of the most expensive delaying retirement saving. The source calls early saving one of the most powerful forces in personal finance and points to the standard chart showing how much earlier starters end with compared to those who wait. It also says if you started late, the second best time is now, and then it offers one of the smartest simple rules in the whole document. Save at least half of every pay raise. Feifilicite Fei turn 80 file 0 Fei. This matters because people lie to themselves in two opposite ways. The young say there is time, the older say there is no point. Both lies destroy the compounding engine. I call this the clock wall trap. The clock wall trap is when you look at time the way a child looks at weather. Too much of it when it would help. Not enough when you finally get serious and somehow always inconvenient. But time does not care what story you tell yourself. It compounds for people who feed it and leaves everyone else to negotiate with regret. Later starting early is powerful because time does more of the heavy lifting. Starting late does not make saving useless. It makes discipline non-negotiable. That is why the half the raise rule is so good. It captures new fuel before the lifestyle machine absorbs it. If you follow that one rule over years, the fortress thickens almost without drama. If you ignore it, income can double while net worth still limps. And then comes the 10th crack, the one people delay because it feels grim, bureaucratic, and unromantic insurance. The source says as net worth grows, insurance needs grow too. Houses appreciate, asset values rise, lawsuit exposure grows, replacement cost shifts. The document advises rechecking coverage regularly and making sure policies actually reflect the value of what is being protected. Feifilicite Fei turn 80 file 0 Fei. This is boring. And because it is boring, it saves more fortunes than glamorous thinking ever does. I call this the perimeter guard. Insurance is the perimeter guard of the fortress. You do not build it because you expect attack tomorrow morning. You build it because when attack does come, you do not want to discover that the watchtower was decorative. Underinsurance is one of the clearest examples of adult laziness disguising itself as prudence. People tell themselves they will look at it later. They assume the old policy still fits the new life. They assume appreciation happened only for wealth, not for replacement cost. They assume nothing dramatic will happen. That assumption is cheaper than updating the paperwork until it is suddenly much more expensive. If you are accumulating wealth, you must also accumulate protection proportionate to what can be lost. Now I want to show you the deeper pattern behind all 10 cracks, because if you only memorize the list, you will still miss the architecture. The poor are often destroyed by visible shortages. The rising wealthy are often destroyed by invisible mismatches. Too much in one asset, too much in one lifestyle, too much leakage to tax, too little attention to refinancing math, too much worship of work, too much confidence after early wins, too much complexity to see clearly, too little liquidity to act, too much delay before compounding, too little perimeter protection. Do you see it? Every trap is a mismatch between what the fortress looks like and how it actually functions under pressure. That is why I keep returning to the metaphor. A fortress is not measured by how impressive it looks in sunshine. It is measured by what survives the siege. Anyone can feel rich in a bull market. Anyone can feel successful after a raise. Anyone can feel smart after a concentrated winner. Anyone can feel secure inside a large house. Anyone can feel advanced with a messy web of accounts and deals. That is all weather. I do not care about weather. I care about architecture. Real wealth architecture asks harder questions. If this single position fell 60%, would the fortress still stand? If income rose again tomorrow, would the lifestyle machine capture it before assets do? If taxes took a larger bite than expected, is there a system or only annoyance? If rates moved in my favor, would I act or procrastinate? If capital now earns more than my extra hour, am I still selling time for ego rather than meaning? If I had early success, have I become more disciplined or merely louder? If I disappeared for a month, could I explain every major line of exposure quickly and honestly? If a great deal arrived next week, could I move cash without setting fire to something else? If retirement is still decades away, am I using time or insulting it? If disaster hit tonight, would the perimeter hold? Those are fortress questions. And fortress questions lead to adult decisions. This is also where the emotional layer matters. Many people think wealth destroys anxiety. Sometimes it simply changes the costume anxiety wears. The broke person fears the rent, the rising wealthy person fears missing out, losing status, getting left behind by peers, paying too much tax, becoming irrelevant, or watching a paper fortune evaporate, because too much of it sat in one beautiful but fragile idea. That is why discipline matters more as net worth rises, not less. You do not become safer because the number got bigger. You become more responsible for the structures around the number. The source, in its own way, is trying to teach exactly that. It is not merely warning about mistakes. It is asking for management maturity as wealth scales. Fay file site, Fay turn 80, file 0, Fay I agree. Maturity is what most net worth growth stories leave out. They talk about returns, they talk about upside, they talk about the first million, the second million, the compounding machine, the big winner, the right sector, the tax shelter, the hot year, the house appreciation, the portfolio screenshot. But they rarely talk enough about the maintenance burden of real wealth. I will, because without maintenance, growth becomes bait, the richer you become. The more your life must resist three diseases: attachment, leakage, rigidity. Attachment is concentration, identity tied to one asset, one role, one status marker. Leakage is tax inefficiency, lifestyle creep, idle inattention, slow, unnecessary bleeding. Rigidity is complexity without control. Illiquidity without planning, overwork without repricing time, underinsurance without respect for risk. If you beat those diseases, your fortress strengthens. If you ignore them, your rising net worth becomes the stage on which your next humiliation will be performed. That is not negative. That is adult. Now let me tell you what a sane fortress policy looks like. You diversify enough that no tower can betray the whole structure. You raise your lifestyle slower than your income. You treat taxes like strategy, not punishment. You do boring math when rates move. You reprice your own time as capital compounds. You distrust confidence built in easy weather. You simplify where complexity no longer earns its keep. You hold enough liquidity to move, defend, and strike. You feed retirement early and capture half the raise before the ego sees it. You review insurance before the disaster explains why you should have. That is not glamorous. That is exactly why it works. Most people who destroy wealth do not do it because nobody ever warned them. They do it because the warning sounded too plain, too unexciting, too administrative, too unlike the dramatic fantasy they secretly wanted wealth to feel like. They wanted wealth to feel like a rival. Real wealth often feels like stewardship that is less fun. It is also the truth. So here is the final question. As your net worth grows, are you building a stronger fortress? Or are you simply decorating a more expensive ruin? Because those are not the same thing. The first path demands humility, systems, and maintenance. The second path rewards ego until the first real siege. One path compounds, the other path leaks. One path gives you more refusal power, more optionality, more peace. The other gives you more things to protect and less actual control. You do not need to fear becoming wealthier. You do need to respect what wealth attracts. Complacency, noise temptation, paper complexity, invisible leakage, identity inflation. Those are the real barbarians. They do not arrive with drums. They arrive with success. And if you do not know how to guard the gates, the fortress you built with so much effort can still fall from the inside. That is the choice in front of you. Not whether you can grow your net worth. Whether you can grow it without letting the cracks grow faster